Hello and welcome to Telewessing's Tech Me Up AI webinar series. I'm pleased that so many across the globe have joined us today, and I'd like to welcome our guests first of all. First, in order of appearance, as they will speak, Fritz Pieper. Fritz is a partner in our tech group in Düsseldorf who focuses on AI law. He's been tracking the AI Act for a while, and he's also created our AI legislation tracker, which you can find on our website. Then I would like to welcome Michael Tan. Michael is our partner heading TW's China TMC practice in Shanghai. He focuses on corporate, IT, regulatory, and data protection matters. He's also chairing the legal working group of European Chamber of Commerce in China. Hi, Michael. Then our guest speaker today, Lisa Thomas, is a partner of Shepherd's Malin Office and Intellectual Property Group in Chicago and is at the firm's privacy and cybersecurity team. She assists clients with matters on the cutting edge of data use and new technologies. She advises clients on collection of biometrics, privacy compliance, data breach, and related matters. In addition to her legal practice, she serves as an adjunct professor at Northwestern University Law School, and she plays the violin in an orchestra of lawyers and judges. Hi, Lisa. And finally, last but not least, I'd like to welcome my dear colleague Vicky from our London office. She's a data protection and privacy lawyer based in London. She advises on all aspects relating to GDPR and has a particular interest on supporting data-rich organization with global projects. We have created a series of webinar events that we'd like to present to you. Today is the first session. We have timed it at 6 p.m. CT and 5 p.m. UK time and 9 a.m. West Coast time to be able to speak to as many people across the globe as possible. The reason is that we want to share our knowledge with a lot of you. We are talking about AI today and regulation of AI worldwide. In the next sessions, we'll be talking about IP, liability, and data. So it's a very interesting program. I'm glad if you can join all the sessions. But just in case you miss one, we will be recording these sessions and you will be able to access the footage later on. In terms of housekeeping, we do not have a Q&A session today, but please feel free to post questions in the chat and the speakers will pick up on these questions later on. Also, if you have any other admin questions, housekeeping purposes, then you can just email our team and they will get back to you. And so, without further ado, I would like to hand over to Fritz, who will tell us something about the AI regulation in Europe. Fritz, to start with, in the beginning, there were a lot of discussions on whether to regulate AI at all, and these were quite intense. Now we have seen the AI Act, which is being negotiated as we speak in front of the 3 EU organizations. You will tell us more about it. But there are still many diverse opinions on this. Can you please shed some light on this?
Happy to do so. Thanks, Thanos, for the introduction. And yes, absolutely. I'll try to shed as much light as possible on AI regulation in the EU as possible in 10 minutes. I think the approach that we can take in this time frame and also looking at a comparison between different jurisdictions would be to first think about how do we approach that topic in general from an EU perspective. Like you already mentioned, there were so many discussions, intense discussions on whether at all, how to regulate AI. And I mean, CEOs of leading tech companies in the US rooting for regulation. I don't think I've seen it in the way it has happened before, or we're not even sure if they really root for regulation or not. And we've seen alarming letters by 150 prominent business executives from all over the EU. And well, what I want to do in this short time frame is just try to approach this in a rational, objective, sound way, and how can we make sense of this in a broad overview. We've all seen the rapid development of AI technologies over years. I mean, many of you can probably remember that chess computers suddenly beat world champions, AlphaGo players, world-class players were beat by software. ChatGPT is the latest example of this, I would say, impressive development, and we could all see that there were multiple benefits and other pros for business and for society. But also, like always, these new technologies involve new risks or disadvantages. Speaking of biased and discriminatory HR personnel selection, voice assistants going wild, cars causing accidents, and like fake pictures where we have to think about, are they real? How did they come about? And with this as a basis, looking at the EU and especially the EU Commission, they do have a political as well as regulatory mandate to look at such developments and try to make sense of it, and potentially also aim for regulation. That's what the member states all over the EU supplied them with, so to say. They have a lot of experience with digital regulation. They have done it for quite a while now. And I think maybe even the so-called Brussels effect, where export of their laws and setting global standards has become at least a term which they discuss. And they've identified AI regulation as a core element of the EU's digital single market strategy. So one of the key pillars of the EU overall. And taking this into the regulatory approach from the EU, there have been so many steps that have been undertaken by the EU and all the different key players in there. I don't want to name them all. I just wanted to show that it started even way before December 17 in the Parliament, but in December 17, all three parties, Commission, Council, and Parliament, set out the legislative priorities, which entailed AI regulation. And you had the implementation of a high-level expert group. You also had public consultations. You also had inception impact assessments where the public and companies were supposed to be involved in the lawmaking procedure in a wider sense. You had a white paper on AI that was 2 or 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago already, where this regulatory approach was laid out for the very first time. And in April 21, you finally had the AI Act proposal. Also, that is already 2 years ago. And so what I just want to say and share in this regard is that this AI regulation in Europe has a long way coming. You could see it coming, and I know there were a lot of discussions, but it seems that it's such a new thing and we don't know how to deal with it. But at least the EU, I'm not a big friend, not the big four of the EU, but they did a lot, right, in preparation to regulate AI. And with those developments that we've seen in the last months and few years, it was kind of natural that something like this would happen on EU level. What's actually happening, I'm sure most of you are aware actually, but just as a very, very quick way to describe what the AI Act entails, was the main piece of legislation for the EU, and also set the scene to sort of enable us to have a comparison with the other jurisdictions, saying the objectives of the AI Act, they sound rather high level and I would say understandable. They want to ensure that fundamental rights of people and values in the EU are kept, and they also want to promote innovation. This balance between innovation and regulation plays a big role in the proceedings. And what they are saying is, if we provide such a framework, we may even be able to provide legal certainty, which is a pro argument, so to say, for that kind of regulation. They want to strengthen governance. They want to say who's responsible for what, who looks at what, who has to decide what, in comparison with bringing AI systems to the market. And in that way, they also want to create a harmonized internal market. I'm sure for all of this, there are also counter arguments, but this is the Commission perspective from the initial proposal, and that's also been kept up by the other institutes like the Council and the Parliament. What they did actually was combine tech law. It's actually software regulation if you look at it. AI is always software, and they regulate the deployment and the creation of software, basically a specific kind of software. Yes, but still it's software regulation. And they take a product law approach from the new legislative framework, which actually isn't really new. You have these notification requirements, you have conformity assessments, you have post-market monitoring, you have market surveillance, all this product law aimed at deploying AI systems. And it's all targeted actually at computer programs. If you look at it, it's a heavy load, absolutely. But this is the way the EU approaches it. And you also have it combined with AI governance. So you have these AI law, legal or EU institutions that deal with that. And mixing these two approaches, they underlaid it, I would say, with a layered approach. They implemented risk categories and corresponding graduation of obligations. So you will see at the right this pyramid scheme where they said we want to distinct between AI systems depending on their risk level. You have prohibited AI systems, high-risk AI systems, which actually are the main focus of regulation, where comprehensive regulatory provisions are actually applicable to those high-risk AI systems. And you have AI systems with lower risks, where you would rather approach them with transparency obligations. And you also have AI systems with minimal risk, which aren't even in the scope of the regulation. The EU says that these systems would actually form the main part of the whole AI sphere, so to say, like spam filters, like AI in computer games, which may be correct, but which may also not be the AI we are really looking at, which pose those risks that we talked about initially. And we also have the so-called new kid in town, generative AI, which got big while the legislative procedure was already ongoing. And that added like an interesting part to the lawmaking process, because you had those drafts from the Commission and the other institutions, and then suddenly they were opposed to this development of generative AI, and they kind of had to make sense of it and implement it in a legislative procedure, which was basically part of the EU Parliament proposal. But this like added also insecurity, I would say, a little bit to how you want to structure the final proposals, and this will also play a crucial role in the trilogue now. So this is basically the, let's say, the basic framework, and looking at what the AI Act constitutes, also in relation to the other regulatory proceedings, I would say that deriving from that, you can say that there is, even if you separate it into risk categories, for example, this hasn't been done in GDPR. You just have personal data and it's heavily regulated. The EU did implement a risk category approach, but still, I mean, they forbid AI systems. A lot of the systems that we're discussing now will potentially be high-risk systems, and there's comprehensive regulation, direct statutory obligations for providers of those systems. So that's really a heavy load, like I already said. It's a big box of measures that companies especially have to deal with. Thinking also about small, medium enterprises, startups, there are not too many distinctions in that regard. So this is basically a new column for company compliance, so to say. We'll have completely new AI compliance that before never was really thought about in that regard. You have the whole supply chain and product life cycle impacted, where you have to check if you're subject to market surveillance procedures, if you're subject to the NLF approach. And what the EU loves to do in their digital regulation is govern everything with high fines in case of non-compliance. We know that from GDPR, but also other regulatory proceedings. It's also implemented in the AI Act. You have national AI authorities as enforcement administration. So you have the legal statutory framework and the national authorities trying to enforce it. You may have some parts where you would say, okay, this is innovative, and you keep innovation going, like AI regulatory sandboxes, but it's a very, very small part. And looking at the final steps, so to say, where are we right now? Can we still stop it? I don't think we can. Actually, the final vote of the parliament has taken place a few weeks ago, a month ago, and we are now in the trilogue phase. That means that the three institutions will discuss what to do with the three proposals from the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament. They have fixed trilogue dates in July, September, October, a few fallback dates. But this actually means that we can expect at the turn of the year the final AI Act for the final EU Parliament vote. It was always a bit unclear, will it really happen at that time frame? But now the signs show that this is likely going to happen. German Bundestag also clarified that they expect the new EU regulation to be passed at the turn of the year. You might have a time frame of 2 years between validity and applicability, like it was the case for GDPR. But this is how the EU sets the scene for global AI regulation, and I'm looking forward to hearing how the colleagues and statutory institutions do it in other jurisdictions to compare. Thanos, you're on mute, at least for me.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Fritz. Thank you very much for this short but very insightful presentation on the AI Act. So handing over to our colleague Michael. And Michael, can you please tell us whether the regulation in China is equally profound and you expect it to move forward as quickly as Fritz has shown here?
Thank you, Thanos. Well, I mean, actually, what I would like to say is that the situation in China can be quite different compared with that in EU. So there has already been a lot of reports from media that China is joining a racing in the AI developments and also in terms of AI governance. It also tries to be advanced and joining the racing so as to build up trust in the use of AI. And that is true to some extent, but purely from a legal perspective, there will be quite a lot of differences which you need to bear in mind that always when dealing with China, the first thing you need to bear in mind is that the whole system is a little bit different. So as you have learned from the EU approach is more or less a kind of bottom-up approach. However, in China, it's a very much top-down approach. This then will relate to how we are going to see the picture in China. So good news is that still the government, the policymakers here, their focus currently is still very much on promoting the AI development. And this can be seen clearly from the plan of the State Council, which was already rolled out in 2017, several years back, which is focusing on how to design its roadmap to the next generation AI technologies. And on the left side, you can see that until 2020, the first step goal is to catch up with developments in the world and making AI a booster for economic growth. And on the right side, on policy side, actually, it only says that it will build up a preliminary framework in some areas, and this exactly will reflect the current status, as you can see from the next slide. And then the next step will be until 2025. Then there will be major breakthroughs in basic AI series and certain leading position in certain AI technological areas. And AI should also become a major booster for the whole industrial upgrade and economy growth pattern switch. And this is the stage we are currently in. And in the legal area, the ambition is or the plan is to build up a preliminary legal and policy framework for AI and focusing on the competence to better manage security and risks. And the final goal will be until 2030, China expects itself to become playing a leading role in the world, becoming a major AI innovation center. And while the whole economy and society is to be converted into an intelligent one, this is very ambitious. And interestingly, if you see on policy side, legal side, it only a further improved legal framework is expected to be established. There you can see that actually the focus will be more on business side to promote development of AI instead of really already having a lot of concerns on how to control and regulate AI. And this is good for business societies, although the current geographical tension is creating the impression that China is closing doors to international business, to international project. However, on regulatory side, actually this is rather relaxed, but certainly there are also some very practical hurdles which I will show you. And here coming to the legal landscape, as you can see that, well, in terms of AI, there have already been quite a lot of existing laws which are regulating various aspects relating to AI. So for example, in 2017, it's very much focusing on cybersecurity. And later on, you have rules regulating internet content. And particularly in the year of 2021, you have data-related laws, the personal information protection law, and also data security law. These all will touch upon some part of AI technologies. And these laws also will regulate AI-related topics. And specific rules were rolled out last year, which took effect on January 10th of this year, which are the administrative provisions regulating deep synthesis services via the internet. And interestingly to see that these provisions only have about 25 articles. So it's very general, very vague, leaving quite a lot of room for interpretation. And how it also reflects the fact that this is quite a new topic also for regulators, as can be seen from the fact that shortly after these rules are in place, then a few months later, another set of rules for generative AI services will also roll out as draft, soliciting public comments. Many aspects are overlapping the existing binding rules, but again, with a little bit of development, still very general. And the evil is always well, in the details. If you look upon the contents, I mean, number one, when we talk about the existing tools, like the cybersecurity law, data security law, personal information protection laws, these are existing legal tools which will regulate the different aspects of AI. And particularly in this regard, what I do like to address is that data flow, this is becoming a big issue as far as international business is concerned, because you hardly can prevent data from flowing across the border. And this becomes a particular issue when dealing with China or operating in China. And then looking upon AI-specific rules, one general feature is that you will find it's a very interesting mixture of many things which you might be familiar. For example, those high-level principles like transparency, non-discrimination, fairness, privacy protection. These are only addressed in very general sense, while on the other hand, some other requirements may potentially collide with all these higher level principles. So that will mean that the existing AI set of rules as rolled out by the policymakers, they only raise the high expectation on how AI should serve, but on the other hand, no real solutions to really promote to encourage innovation and experimental application are yet available. So it's quite a complicated picture. And on the other hand, many elements are already there under existing system, like real ID verification, which you may not have in the West. However, here, all service providers, you are required to know whoever you are serving. You need to keep a proper record of their identity and verify that. So any service offering on anonymous basis, that's not allowed. And then you have censorship system to be built up. You need to manage content. Any illegal content will need to be properly managed and interfered with. And also addiction prevention system needs to be built up. So these are more China featured and also national security. There should not be any jeopardizing of national security. This is quite a sensitive topic, which can quite often confuse foreign companies. And there, just by reading the theoretical terms, likely you will go to nowhere. So you need quite a lot of practical insight and experience in dealing with all these Chinese featured terminologies. And on the other hand, some more neutral topics like IP protection, data protection, privacy protection, this you also have under a typical EU or US jurisdictions. So this is in a nutshell. the existing AI specific rules in China are all very general, and how you interpret that, how you apply that depends very much on the discretionary interpretation of the regulators, and also you will need quite some practical insight in order to better manage this topic. So this will be all I would like to share within these 10 minutes regarding the Chinese situation. And then I would like to also hear a bit about how the situation will be looking like in other jurisdictions.
Thank you very much, Michael. So it sounds like China is quite evolved in terms of AI regulation. So to hand over to Lisa. Lisa, can you tell us how AI is regulated in the US, if it is regulated at all?
I would be happy to, and thank you again for asking me to join this panel. It's very interesting to hear the differences, and as Michael said, we have China is very different, and then the US is again different. So when anyone asks me to explain the regulatory approach in the US, I always remind folks that we need to start by thinking beyond just the regulation. So before we look at what regulatory developments have happened in the artificial intelligence space, especially since the increase in availability of generative AI, I think it's helpful to take a step back and remember that we are not a civil law country, except for one of our states, Louisiana. We are a common law country. And what that means is that rather than passing laws, we typically, when we see a new technology or a new activity, regulate based on bringing cases. So we rely on existing laws, and in particular, unfair and deceptive trade practices laws. The primary regulator in this space is the Federal Trade Commission, and they are very active in any new development, anything where they fear that there's going to be unfairness or deception. So you saw the same thing, or we saw the same thing with their approach towards privacy that began in 1997. And they also have been focusing on AI since 2016. So about the same time that you're seeing in other jurisdictions where we begin to see regulatory activity, what the Federal Trade Commission does is they will issue guidance or direction and say, if you do certain activities or if you fail to do certain things, they're going to view that as an unfair or deceptive practice. We see other regulators at a state level take a similar approach. So they will also find that activities are unfair or deceptive. To date, the Federal Trade Commission has actually brought 8 cases where they have explained that these involved situations where artificial intelligence, generative AI in particular, was used, or things that are like it, were used in an unfair or deceptive way. In order to give more specific guidance, rather than in the US, we generally see sort of activity from the Federal Trade Commission, then we will see activity from industry groups. And so industry groups will issue recommendations to members in their industry saying, you know, if we as an industry fail to do this, then we will have a risk of having the Federal Trade Commission or a state authority or plaintiffs' class action attorneys bringing cases against us. So here are the things we as an industry will agree to do. And as I sort of alluded to, one of the things that we really worry about in the US and from a monetary standpoint for companies is often private rights of action, private causes of action, individual plaintiffs bringing lawsuits against companies alleging that activities were typically unfair or deceptive. So what is it when we think about AI regulation? And today we're really focused in the middle bucket about discrimination. But there have been, and I just wanted to highlight this because when you're looking at developments in the United States, you're going to see them coming in these 3 different areas. One is going to be sort of an intellectual property ownership space where people are talking about have we infringed on the rights of someone else when we use generative AI, and the generative AI created content that we don't know if the data set that was being used was copying or infringing on someone else's rights. Then there's also the other side of that, the question of ownership. When we've worked with generative AI to create something, do we own that content? And so our U.S. Copyright Office has issued some guidance on that on that front. On the other side, we have privacy issues. So the data sets that are going into the generative, what the generative AI is relying on in order to create its content, are we infringing on individuals' personal, private rights? Are we infringing on their privacy? So we see things in both of those spaces, but where we're really seeing a lot of activity right now is in the middle. So the FTC, as I mentioned, first started investigating or sort of looking at this in 2016, asking for input from the industry, trying to kind of wrap their hands around what should their guidance, in other words, what do you need to do to avoid a suit from the Federal Trade Commission for unfair or deceptive trade practices? What should their guidance look like? The first one was in 2020. Then we had an update in 2022, and then again this year. And in sum, all of these guidance look very similar to what the type of regulation that you're going to see in other jurisdictions. So be transparent about your use of the tool, be fair in the outcome that is created from the use of the tool, make sure that the tool is accurate, be accountable to individuals in terms of the fact that you're using this tool and that you're doing it correctly. So the FTC came out with those guidance, and they're sort of refining them. As I mentioned, they've brought suits where they feel that companies are not doing these things. And we're starting to see other federal agencies that are following suit. I think it was just a couple days ago, or I saw it this morning, the EEOC, which is our Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I might have the acronym not quite right, but essentially in the employment space, we're seeing, this is an expectation if you're using AI tools in the way that you hire people, that outcome is fair, that it's not discriminatory. We saw at the state level, New York passed a law. We see states that are starting in the US. There's been a lot of publicity around US states that are passing laws that are similar, but not quite the same as GDPR. Some of them are starting to talk about this concept of unfairness and deception. So these are, when you're hearing about, hopefully, AI now in the United States context, this will give you a rubric for sort of deciding which bucket does that AI development go into. So what are we kind of expecting to see in the coming months, years? Certainly clarification around ownership, and then on the privacy side, probably a lot of development in terms of protecting the information that goes into the data sets. But at the discrimination side, so sort of this middle bucket that we've been thinking about, I think that we'll see more laws that get more specific, or else guidance that's enforced under unfair and deceptive trade practices laws about how do we protect individuals from negative outcomes, from not getting that job, from not having the AI work. You might have an AI tool that has been trained on a data set that is primarily one group of people. So it might be a data set that's primarily white men. And in the healthcare industry, perhaps that if we use the AI outcome and we apply it to minority women, that is going to be discriminatory and a negative outcome, because the health outcome for the white men might not be the same as for the minority women. So these are the kinds of things that we would anticipate that we're going to see a lot more activity around, is really protecting individuals. probably a lot in the employment space, as I mentioned, in the health space, and really anywhere where the use of these tools could have a legally significant or a materially significant impact on the individual. And I really think that this is where we're going to see the most activity, probably here and in the privacy space. Although I would expect in the privacy space, we'll see if I'm right, we may not see as much regulatory activity. We may see more enforcement activity relying on existing unfair and deceptive trade practices laws. So that's the US in a sort of really quick snapshot. And so I think I will, Thanos, turn it back over to you to move us on to kind of rounding out our view of the world.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That's super interesting. I especially like the aspects on the difference between EU and US law. And one thing that I noted is the part on dark patterns, which is something that we discuss in the EU a lot, although in a different context. But just to finalize kind of your view, what's the biggest concern in the AI front right now in the US? Can you maybe just give us one sentence or two just to round this up?
So maybe I'll do it one sentence as a putting on my hat as a mother and saying, this is what not to do. So don't be deceptive, don't be unfair. So that seems like a really broad statement, but you can really use it whenever you're looking at an AI tool that your team is coming to you and thinking, is this going to result in unfair discriminatory practices? That was a lot more than a sentence, I'm sorry.
That's fine, thanks a lot. So then I'd like to welcome Vicky on stage. Vicky, how is the situation in the UK, and is it the Wild West for AI developers or users in the UK, or will there be any regulation at all?
Thanks, Thanos. So it's not exactly the Wild West. And to continue the analogy, it's almost as if if you imagine each town has its sheriff, that sheriff is responsible for the activities within that town. And I'll come back to that a little bit later as to exactly what I mean. But looking back, 2022, the UK government set out its preliminary approach to regulating AI, and it indicated that it would be context specific, pro-innovation, risk-based, coherent, proportionate, and adaptable. And in particular, the UK set out its stall really saying that it's going to be deliberately different from the EU approach. And you can just see from this clip from the document, the policy document, what the UK government said. Well, we think that the EU's approach is a product safety approach, just as Fritz has mentioned earlier. And the UK government doesn't think that's the right approach for the UK. And this is because a lot of this is because they think that the lack of granularity could hinder innovation. So that's sort of the starting point as to where the current UK government is thinking about regulating AI. So if we take that forward, then we then had, fast forward to March this year, a white paper from the UK government, which they're consulting on. The consultation closed a few weeks ago. And the key objectives of that white paper, the government said, is the way that they're going to regulate. It's about economic growth. We want to make sure that AI, the way that we regulate it, doesn't stifle economic growth. We want to increase public trust. So a lot of this is about education, awareness. And we want to have a global position. Essentially, the UK is having that leadership position. And one of the ways that the government wants to do this is to effectively have a central framework, which the UK government will be responsible for putting in place and maintaining, and it will support these regulators, or the sheriffs, as I mentioned earlier, to regulate AI in their space. And this means the government will monitor, assess, evaluate, and provide feedback on how the framework is developing. It will support within that group of regulators a coherent implementation of the principles. I'll come back in a moment to those principles. It's then also going to develop a cross-sectoral risk assessment function to help ensure that risks are considered across the whole economy. So very much a sort of horizon scanning as well, to see what developments are coming up, to group together, to bring organisations together, bits of the economy together, and bits of the business sector together to understand what these developments mean. To then also enable support through innovation, through test beds, sandboxes, allowing AI businesses to test out and receive feedback on their AI systems. And then also this piece about education and awareness. And that's awareness and education for consumers so that they understand the new world of AI, but also guidance for businesses. And we've also recently seen the government make some quite significant announcement about investment in both UK universities and also a task force on foundation models to develop safe and reliable AI. So this is all part of the kind of the regulatory package that the UK government is proposing. And so actually what they're saying is we're not going to put together black letter law. So in contrast to what we're seeing in the EU, for instance, we're not looking at a UK AI Act at this stage. We're going to effectively arm and enable existing regulators like Information Commissioner's Office, the Financial Conduct Authority, etc., to regulate AI in their space. So this is the whole idea of the responsible sheriff regulating the activity in their own remit, within their own remit. And then what the regulators need to do is implement the regulation according to these 5 principles which are set out on the slide here. And these effectively are building on the OECD AI principles around ethical use of AI. And they will overlap, as many of you will already see, with certain GDPR principles that we're familiar with. Now, there's been quite a bit of criticism of this UK approach. Some would say it's too light touch, that it lacks real meat and substance. And of course, there are some immediate issues that sort of spring off the page. You've got to ensure that those regulators are coordinated. So you may well be a business that operates in more than one sector. So what do you do when you're facing regulatory guidance from different regulators where that regulatory guidance conflicts? So there has to be a degree of consistency and coherence. And that's part of what the government is saying they're going to do by having this central function. But then there's also the argument, well, what about if you're in a sector which is not actually subject to any additional regulatory scrutiny? So for instance, you're just a tech company, you're not providing financial services of any sort. Does that mean they're going to be subject to a lower level of scrutiny because of that? However, just sort of fast forward from March, in May, as this is a story in The Guardian, there seems to be a bit of a shift from the UK government moving to begin to sort of suggest a more tightly regulated approach to AI. And this is partly, I think, in response to some of this criticism, as well, of course, as many of you will know, some of the statements made by some of the leaders around AI. So there were reports in May that the UK Prime Minister is changing tack to tighten the rules around AI. Also in May, we saw the Competition and Markets Authority that regulates competition announced that they are going to review the markets for foundation models. And this is all beginning to signal that the response to the consultation, so the actual more legislative response or regulatory response that the UK government's going to come out with, will contain more policy proposals than the initial white paper. However, it's still unlikely that we're going to get, as it were, a specific AI regulator. So putting all that into to picture of the the next few months or the next years or so in the UK, it's also worth being aware that the UK could see a change of government next year. And so it's useful to look at what is the actual opposition party, the Labour Party, saying about AI. They have said in June that they're looking for AI to be licensed in the same way as medicines or nuclear power. So that would suggest a stricter regime than the current government is suggesting, and to license AI through a sort of an arm's length government body. They're also talking about introducing a centralised AI regulatory function if they win power in 2024. Then in June, we have seen the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak on his visit to the US and in discussions with President Biden come away with an announcement that the UK will host the first global summit on safety in AI this autumn. And that is because the UK government wants to sort of position itself as a bridge between, say, the EU and the US and China. Now, whether or not that comes to pass, we'll have to wait and see. But obviously, the summit is going ahead. It also suggests that the Prime Minister Sunak is looking to pursue a global approach to AI through other forums. So we understand that it was raised at the recent G7 talks, and the idea to sort of set up or draw up some international guardrails rather than have a sort of a UK black letter law. Again, we will have to wait and see how that will develop. But I hope that gives a little picture of what the likely regulatory picture for AI in the UK. Thanos, I think I'm waiting for you to join me.
Yes, sorry, I was trying to come on stage, but it just took a while. It seems that my internet was somehow blocked by AI or something. Just as a last question to round this up, Vicky, do you think that the UK will follow the EU's example and also come up with an AI Act similar to what it did with the GDPR, for example, or maybe with the online safety bill, which kind of, tried to do this something similar as the Digital Services Act?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, like the EU AI Act, not likely. I think that it's unlikely that the UK would put in place law like the EU AI Act, but it is possible that the UK government could introduce a statutory duty on those regulators to have regard to the 5 core AI principles that were mentioned a few slides back. And it, of course, is always possible that the UK government could come back and legislate if they felt it was necessary. And I think the kind of factors that they'll be watching is how well do those sheriffs, as it were, those independent regulators perform? How does the EU AI Act get on once it's implemented? What does the general public opinion around AI, is that crying out for some kind of regulation? And then again, this question of a change in government in the UK. I think all those factors could play into whether or not we actually do see some kind of black letter law in due course.
Thank you very much, Vicky. So with that, I hope that we gave everyone a very short but high-level update on AI and regulation worldwide. I like to thank Fritz, Vicky, Michael, and Lisa for their contributions. And I'd like to thank all of you for all the questions that you posted. As I said at the beginning, the speakers will pick up on these questions and will respond to you directly. And we're happy to get more questions if you have those. We are looking forward to the next session, which will be on IP in 2 weeks' time, and it will be followed by a session on liability and then a session on data. So interesting sessions, please join, and thank you very much again to our speakers, and goodbye, everyone.